In our present research, we found another important international crisis or problem, and that is relating to the refugees, which is now a common international problem to all the nation states. And in that regard, we would like to discuss what exactly refugee means and how refugee is being defined generally and in international documents, and what are the refugee laws in relation to international aspects. So, in that connection, although we found certain evidences of refugees in ancient times, in particularly the Jews, those who became refugees, and in modern times, would like to begin from the Protestants, as in 1685, when the very edict of Nantes in France was revoked by the French authorities. So, the very Protestants who were living in France, they fled to other countries from France. So the Protestants became the first refugees in the modern time. In 1685, as per the evidences we found. So, in the very introduction, we don't want to deal with the ancient refugees or about the outcome of those Protestants who fled from France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. We just want to discuss in this lecture about the Russian refugees in the year 1917 to 1921, when exactly the Bolshevik Revolution or the Civil War in Russia, which was led under the able leadership of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in 1918, and which was otherwise known at that time as the October Revolution, and which established the communist government in the then Russia. So, most of the opponents of the Bolshevik Revolution or the patronage and exponents of the imperial authority of the then Tsar Nicholas II, they left Russia, and mostly they became refugees in different parts of Europe. So the very problem attracted the attention of the international community in 1921. So also after the First World War, the international community faced such problems of large number of refugees. So the international community made a first attempt to organize itself and to create institutions designed to prevent the recurrence of such catastrophes. So in 1921, Refugee Nansen, the first High Commissioner for Refugees, acting within the framework of the newly established League of Nations, undertook a real crusade which resulted eventually in a number of international agreements benefiting the various groups needing assistance at that time, such as the Russians, Armenians, the Turkish refugees, and subsequently the refugees from Germany and Austria. So, for the first time in 1938, the mandate given to the International Governmental Committee on Refugees set up to deal with refugees from Germany mention the causes of flight of those persons who must immigrate on account of their political opinions, religious beliefs, or racial origin. So in 1946, in the Constitution of International Refugee Organization or IRO, drawn up by the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations Organization, the notion of prosecution or well-founded fear of it was first spelled out in full. So now we would like to go to the very definition of refugees. So what exactly refugee means and how it is being defined. So in that connection, we would like to discuss the very general definition or the common definition of a refugee. So what exactly a refugee is commonly defined as that any person who is obliged to flee his habitual place of residence and seek refuge elsewhere. This situation may result from two fundamentally different types of event. Either a natural disaster such as an earthquake or a flood, or what is referred to nowadays as man-made disaster, such as any international armed conflict, civil war, revolution, or persistent general socio-political instability. And as it is defined in 1946 by the International Refugee Organization, and it was drawn up by the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations Organization. The very notion of prosecution or well-founded fear of it was first spelled out in full. So exactly it means this represented a twofold innovation. The fact not only of describing the reasons which make a person a refugee, but also associating those reasons with a partly subjective element, and that is namely we could say fear based on well-founded grounds of prosecution. And very this conception was continued to prevail up to 1950 when under the auspicious of United Nations General Assembly, the Statute of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee was drawn up. It was repeated in the Convention relating to the status of refugees of the following year, commonly known as the 1951 Convention. Therefore, the first time we found a general, universally applicable definition of the term refugee. So, after referring to the refugee groups to which earlier agreements or conventions had been concerned, the Statute of United Nations High Commissioner Refugees provides in its paragraph B and Article 6 that the competency of the High Commissioner shall extend to any other person who is outside the country of his nationality, or if he has no nationality, the country of his former habitual residence, because he has or had well founded fear of prosecution by reason of his religion, nationality, or political opinion, and is unable, or because of such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of the government of the country of his nationality, or if he has no nationality, to return to the country of his former habitual residence. So the very convention of 1951 related only to these persons who had become refugees as results of event occurring before 1st January 1951. Moreover, governments had the discretion to apply the provisions of the convention to persons who had become refugees as a result of events occurring in Europe or elsewhere. Thus, the Hungarian refugees who left their country in 1956 were able to benefit from the convention, since the host countries extend the benefit of the convention to them. So, this dual restriction of time and place was to remain until the 1951 Convention, and ultimately it was amended by the Protocol of 1967. So, exactly, while defining who is exactly a refugee, as we found that anyone who is in a fear of prosecution on the grounds of either race, religion, nationality, or of political opinion or belief by the state to which he belongs, if that fear of prosecution is well founded and he left his own country to migrate to another country. And in such case, such person would be considered as a refugee. So now we would like to discuss after the very definition of the concept of refugee as we found the general definition. So also how it was defined under International Refugee Organization. So also under the Convention of Status of Refugee of 1951 and the Statute of United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee, which was established in 1951. So now we would like to discuss the very origin and development of refugee crisis. So on that connection, first we found that the very origin and development and evolution or history of refugee crisis could be traced from Europe, because Europe, which in 1685, when the French authorities they revoked the Edict of Nantes, so most of the Protestants in France they fled from France to other different neighboring countries of France. So, in that connection, it would be wise to discuss the very origin and development which traced its origin to European refugee crisis. So, shortly after the inception of the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in 1951, it appeared that within the estimated 2 million refugees coming within its competence, several hundreds of thousands, including nearly 1 lakh still living in camps in Europe, would need material assistance with a view to becoming integrated in their country of residents or being resettled in other countries. Consequently, the office was authorized by the General Assembly of the United Nations Organization to launch assistance program for these refugees meant to achieve permanent solution to their problems. The new upheavals brought about a considerable further influx of European refugees mainly into Austria in 1956 and in 1968. Mention should also be made of the arrival of Asians of undetermined nationality expelled from Uganda, as well as the Chileans from Latin America resettling in European countries in the 1950s and 1960s, and of other non-European refugees stranded mainly in these countries. Taking all these developments into account, the United Nations High Commission of Refugees Assistance Program was being continued since 1974. United Nations High Commissioner Refugees had been confronted with the problem of displaced persons in Cyprus. So, in the very August 1974, of that year, the High Commissioner was nominated by the Secretary General as coordinator of United Nations humanitarian assistance in Cyprus and undertook a large scale program of relief and assistance for the benefit of over 2 lakh persons displaced and seriously affected by the events of that country. So, now we would like to go to the refugee crisis that developed and originated among the Latin American countries or the South American countries like Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, etc. So the United Nations High Commissioner Refugee had also been facing at that time the outstanding problems of some 1 lakh European refugees in Latin America. These were, however, overshadowed by those of the refugees from Chile and other Latin American countries such as Bolivia, Brazil, and Uruguay. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was at first called upon to intervene in Chile with a view to providing protection and assistance for refugees of Latin American countries who were in that country at the time of the change of government. In September 1973, subsequently large size program had to be launched in order to provide thousands of Chilean refugees with emergency relief, mainly in Argentina and Peru, and to help them to resettle in other countries. Following recent developments, those recent developments which occurred during the 1970s and 80s, which compounded by that of an increasing number of refugees from other countries in Latin America. Furthermore, the great majority of these refugees were in transit while awaiting resettlement opportunities in other countries. Their legal position was most unsatisfactory. They were unable to take up employment. Some of them had been abducted, tortured, and killed, while others were exposed to a similar fate. There is settlement through migration had therefore become a most urgent matter. So, in this lecture, almost we have discussed what exactly refugee means and what the very origin of the very problem and crisis of refugee. Even though in ancient time we found number of instances of refugees and in particularly regarding the Jews, but the very current development that we have discussed from 1685 when the very edict of Nantes was revoked by the French authorities in 1685. So The Protestants, they fled from France and they became refugees in neighboring countries of France in Europe. And after that, we straight jumped to the Russian refugee crisis, which was resulted out of the civil war in Russia, which broke out in the 1917 and 1980s as Bolshevik Revolution, which was under the leadership of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and which ultimately established the communist rule in Russia and was identified as Soviet Union. So from there, we started our discussion on this lecture and also the very role played by League of Nations and how the first ever High Commissioner of Refugee, Firoz Nansen, and the role played by him in regards to determining and rehabilitation and assistance to refugees under the able guidance of him as under the auspices of his of League of Nations. Then we went to the definition of refugees as it was generally defined, and the definition as propounded under the International Refugee Organization in 1946 and also the very convention of 1951 on this very status of refugees and also the definition given under the statute of United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee. And then we proceeded the very origin and development of modern international refugee crisis. And in that connection, we have discussed the very origin and development of refugee crisis, initially in Europe, starting from the Russian refugees during the Civil War in the 1917 to 1921, and also then we discussed about the refugee problem or crisis in Latin American countries. And in our next upcoming video, we would like to discuss part 2 relating to this particular lecture, which is based on refugees and refugee law. And in that connection, we would like to discuss in our next upcoming video the very refugee crisis that the world faced in the African continent and Asian continent, and how far the role played by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee in mitigating the refugee problems and crises, and also the role played by the very convention of 1951 determining the status of refugees. And finally, we would like to discuss in our upcoming video to conclude our discussion on this lecture relating to the refugees and refugee law. So, we would like to meet our next lecture in regards to the African refugee crisis and Asian refugee crisis.